close your eyes and picture this. You're 10 years old, it's Friday evening, and you're looking at a stack of Game Boy cartridges and a SNES controller. And you're itching to get a new game, so you count your pocket money and you realise you've just enough to rent a title from Blockbuster for the weekend. Maybe you're hunting for a copy of Final Fantasy VII or Resident Evil. But you usually settle for a movie time like Lion King, which, let's be honest, was secretly the hardest game ever made. And then you hear mom shout, "Do you want to go to Blockbuster?" And suddenly, the world is a great place. You're locked in for the weekend. The world of gaming in the 90s and 2000s was wild, chaotic, and full of rules that nobody wrote down unless you had the cheat codes. It was 16, 32, and 64-bit action, which feels just as special as today. PC gaming was just arriving, and if you weren't going to Blockbuster, you were hauling a CRT monitor to a LAN party. Even booting up the console back then was an experience in itself. That original PlayStation startup sound, it hit like a jump scare. Pure silence then. If the screen went black for too long, your heart just sank. Those sounds are burned into our brains forever. You hear them now and you're instantly 8 years old sitting way too close to the TV. There was no online gaming, no tutorials unless you bought a magazine guide, and the only way to try before you buy was going to Toys R Us and hoping they had the demo of the game you wanted on the display kiosk. You bought based upon how cool the packaging looked, or a magazine review, or because your school friends said it was good. There was no way to know if it was a masterpiece or a disaster until you got home. Often it was terrible, but sometimes you got lucky, and yet it was magical. Gaming in the 90s and 2000s wasn't global. It was your street, your friends, your basement or garage, and if someone had Super Mario Kart with 2 controllers, they were worshipped. If you beat a secret boss in Donkey Kong or the big boss in Sonic, you were a legend for the week. If you could complete Golden Axe in one go, you were a god. Gaming in the 90s and 2000s was life, but not your whole life. You would often end up at the local neighbourhood kid's house who had multiple controllers and a console. Usually you'll be in a garage on a smelly couch fighting over who got the good controller because that sticky button was always the reason you lost. Or in my case, it's because we had a chair which we named the bugger eating chair. In the middle of an intense 1v1 on Tekken 3, the thing would just collapse. It would leave you in an impossible position to see the screen, let alone win, while my best friend Kit would just sit there laughing his head off as he snatched victory. The innovation we used on split screen was something else, just like when we used to hide your controller when taking a penalty on FIFA World Cup 98. During the summer holidays, our parents would leave us at home while they went to work, which meant we just gamed for as long as we liked. The best players in the game were always in your neighbourhood. The word gamers just wasn't used back then. It was, he's the best at GoldenEye, or she was the best at Super Mario. And there's always that one kid who would rage every time he lost, throwing the controller at the screen, breaking the controller and the screen at the same time. When we got bored, we wanted to go out and play, we just left the game on pause because nobody ever had a save game cartridge, and we just prayed that mum hadn't turned the console off by the time we got home, as it was always when the streetlights came on. But when mum was at home, she'd always walk in a new gaming at the most inappropriate of times. Now, playing games wasn't just amazing because of the social aspect. We also had solo adventures that we went on. It was a different type of magic. You'd go to the store, buy a random game because of the cover art, and on the car ride home, you'd be reading the game manual from cover to cover. And you played the game all weekend, and on Monday morning at school, you told your friends all about it. Your friends rented it, and they always came to you for advice, making you the sensei of that game at the school, which was always so cool. The cartridges were small, but the games inside were enormous. They were warm, often needed to be blown in to get into work, and we often didn't look at the load screen to not jinx it. The PlayStation disc needed blowing onto, rubbing, and sometimes cleaning with toothpaste to get into work, and the gameplay itself was immense. No in-game purchase, no distractions, just you and the game. But let's talk about save files, because this was a real source of anxiety growing up. Memory cards filled up fast, and at some point, a decision had to be made. You had to choose which save had to die. Someone's half-finished Tomb Raider, your cousin's Gran Turismo's career, or your own 40-hour Final Fantasy run that you swore you'd come back to. You'd hover over the delete button, sweating, knowing that this was permanent. PC gaming back then was a tiny, secretive corner of the world. While the console kids were just plugging and playing, we were battling with the MS-DOS prompts, the config sys files, just to get a game to launch. It felt less like a hobby, more like a high-stakes science experiment. You weren't just playing Doom or Diablo, you were installing them from a literal mounting of 3.5-inch floppy disks, praying that disk 7 of 10 didn't have a read error that would ruin your entire afternoon. Most kids didn't know these worlds existed. To them, a computer was for schoolwork, but for us, it was the only place you could find the sheer addiction of Championship Manager, or the glorious, pixelated chaos of Lemmings. If you wanted to play with friends, there was no join party button. You were hauling a 20-kilo CRT monitor to a mate's house, tripping over yellow Ethernet cables and spending 3 hours just trying to get the IP addresses to talk to each other so you could finally play Quake or Command & Conquer. It was a massive effort, but once you were in, it felt like you were part of a secret underground society that a console world just couldn't even imagine. We often had gaming wars between the N64 and the PlayStation 1, the Nintendo versus the Sega Mega Drive, and we can never forget the SNES and later on the Dreamcast, which was light years ahead of its time, the Xbox, the GameCube and the PS2. There's always a snobbery from the N64 players to the PlayStation players, with the Mega Drive just being the cost-effective option in the background. We didn't think the graphics could get any better. I mean, look at them, and we seriously think the moon landing was CGI'd. But gaming wasn't just about the cartridges, it was about the hardware and all those little extras. Limited edition consoles were the ultimate flex. The Pikachu N64, the translucent shells in jungle green or grape, and the icy blue Game Boy Color, or even the shiny platinum GameCube. If you had one, you were the envy of the block. And then there were peripherals, the rumble packs for the N64 that shook your hands, the light guns, the multi-tap so 4 friends could duke it out. Handhelds were a ritual too, link cables to trade Pokemon so you could get your Gengar or your Machamp. And you were squinted at non-backlight Game Boy screens on the street lamps or in the back of your mum's car unless you were lucky enough to have a worm light. Magazines were our internet. Flipping through Nintendo Power, EGM, Game Master or Meme Machines was like decoding a treasure map. They weren't just magazines, they were Bibles. You spend £3 or $5, which back then was a lot of pocket money, just to see screenshots of games that wouldn't be out for 6 months. They were packed with cheat sections that would memorize like a friend's home telephone number. Some magazines even came with a demo disc for the PlayStation, and we'll play the same 2 levels of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1,000 times just because we didn't have the full game yet. Buying games back then was an event in itself. Toys R Us was the cathedral of gaming, where you spend hours at the demo games before you took the paper slip to the counter. Games were really expensive. $60 and £50 might sound normal now, but back then with the minimum wage at $3 to $4 or £3 an hour, this was an absolute fortune. It's why we set up lemonade stands, we mowed lawns and we washed cars as kids just so we could afford the latest console or cartridge. Due to how expensive they were, we always knew someone who could chip your PlayStation, so you could buy your games for $5 or £5. I mean, it was really good while it lasted, but in my case, my PlayStation died completely 6 months later, which was absolutely heartbreaking. Then there were the myths, and this was before the internet could instantly ruin them. Gaming in the 90s and 2000s was full of rumours that spread instantly by word of mouth. Someone always knew someone who'd done it. The biggest of them all was a Mew which was hiding underneath the truck near the SSN in Pokemon. If you skipboarded the ship, surf around the dock, and used strength from that truck, the Mew would appear. None of it was true, but the truck was real. Glitches did exist, and there was enough to keep the legend alive for years. It wasn't just Pokemon, kids swore Luigi was hidden somewhere in Super Mario 64. That you could unlock the Triforce and Ocarina of Time if you did everything perfectly. That Reptile was playable in Mortal Kombat if you won without blocking. And then GTA came along and took the gaming myths to a whole other level. But keep in mind, back then people were convinced that Bigfoot lived in the forest, that ghosts would appear in graveyards, and Leatherface roamed the countryside. Most of it wasn't real, but Rockstar leaned so hard into it made everything believable. And if you weren't looking for that Mew under the truck or Bigfoot in the woods, you were one of us. One of the real holy grails of that era were the Pizza Hut demo discs. You'd order a stuffed crust and walk with a cardboard sleeve containing Crash Bandicoot or Metal Gear Solid. We're playing those games on the same 2 levels 1,000 times until the disc was scratched to bits. It was the ultimate try before you buy, and it usually smelled like pepperoni. Then there were the arcades, the real social hubs of the 90s. Neon lights, clanging pinball machines, and the smell of popcorn. You'd insert your quarter or your 50p and step up to the cabinet like NBA Jam, Time Crisis, or Mortal Kombat. And suddenly you're part of the community, a weird, noisy, competitive tribe. Arcades were the only place you could see impossible graphics. While we were playing 16-bit at home, the arcade had Virtua Fighter or Daytona USA with 3D polygons that looked like the future. You put your coin on the glass of the screen to say, "I've got next," and the tension while you waited for the current King of the Hill to finish was insane. And when you lost to a 4-foot-tall kid who somehow pulled off a 32-hit combo, bow to your new overlord and try again. If you were playing a light gun game like the House of the Dead, you'd have a literal crowd of strangers cheering as you hit every headshot. Arcades weren't just about the games. They were rituals, proving grounds, and the closest thing we had to an original social network. Not every idea worked out though. Some were the right idea but the wrong execution. Take Nintendo's Virtual Boy from 1995. A tabletop 3D console with red-only graphics that made your eyes water and your head spin. It barely lasted a year. Or the Tiger R-Zone, a head-mounted handheld that made you look like a cyborg while you stared into a tiny mirrored screen. Then there was a Laseractive, a hybrid beast that tried to combine movies and games using giant laser discs. It was heavy, expensive, and just confusing. Gaming was a wild frontier. For every success there was a spectacular failure, like the Apple Pippin or the Amiga CD32. Short-lived consoles tried to bridge a gap to a multimedia era that we just weren't quite ready for yet. Games were hard, like really hard. Cartridges had limited memory, so developers crammed in tricky puzzles, respawning enemies, and unfair jumps to make a 2-hour game last 20 hours. You couldn't breeze through it, you needed skill, patience, and sometimes sheer luck. They were designed with arcade logic. The harder the game, the more the quarters you spend. If a game was too easy to beat, you'd rent it once and never buy it, so companies like Disney made games like The Lion King or Aladdin brutally difficult just so you could have to own it to see the ending. Can't figure out the wall in Simon's Quest? No internet, no YouTube, no Reddit, your only hope was the Game Genie. The giant plastic brick you shove into your console to rewrite the code for infinite lives. If you didn't have a Game Genie, you were begging your parents to let you call the video game hotline. These were premium rate numbers where a games counselor would literally talk you through a boss fight. Be on the phone for 20 minutes at $2 a minute praying your dad didn't see the phone bell, just to find out how to jump into a random pit to find the secret key. But cheat codes weren't just about cheating, they were culture. Up, up, down, down, left, right, B8 wasn't just a code, it was a muscle memory. You learned them from magazines, from school, or that one kid who claimed his uncle worked at Nintendo. Big head mode, infinite ammo, invincibility, you felt like you just cracked the code in the Matrix. Looking back, it wasn't just about the pixels or the plastic. It was the anticipation of the car ride home from the shop, the arguments over whose turn it was next, and the sheer grit it took to beat a game without a walkthrough. We lived in a world where the secrets were shared on the playground, not on Reddit, and where a sticky controller was our biggest problem. Gaming has changed. The graphics are lifelike, the worlds are infinite, and you can play with anyone on the planet at a touch of a button. But there's a specific kind of magic from the 90s and 2000s that a 4K resolution just can't replicate. But I want to hear from you. What was that one game that defined your childhood? Was it a masterpiece you rated from Blockbuster or a budget title you bought just because the cover art looked cool? And more importantly, did you ever actually beat the monkey level in The Lion King? Let me know in the comments because I'm still convinced it was possible. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, hit the like button. It really helps the channel to grow, and subscribe if you're going to see more deep dives into the gold era of tech, gaming and nostalgia. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.